Okay, so it's a pleasure to have here with us Professor Daron Acemoglu. I think you don't need any presentation. Everyone knows you. Here in Portugal, we have a strong community that is keen of your books. First, with Why the Nations Fail, we consider that a Bible for most of us about the economic equation of nations. And now most of us are reading Power and Progress, as I told you, is already translated for Portuguese. And I think, Darren, the idea is that you can speak a little bit about your book, what you think about the power and progress of the nations, and then we'll have a discussion between all of us. Thank you very much again for your disponibility, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you for everybody for joining me here. It's my pleasure to talk about my new book, and let me share my screen to make some preliminary comments, and then we can open it up for discussion. Let me see. Okay. Okay, here we go.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about my new book with Simon Johnson, and I'm really delighted to hear that Portuguese was one of the first languages into which it has been translated. I think it's come out in 3 other languages so far, so I'm delighted, and I'll share about our thinking and some of the main ideas in the book to open up the conversation. You know, the book is written in contrast to my earlier works, which was about the economic development problem around the world. It's a little bit more US-centric, partly because it is about technology and the future of technology, how it will impact work, society, democracy. And of course, US has a special place in shaping that technology. And the reason why we wrote the book, we wrote it before ChatGPT was released, but ChatGPT is a continuation of earlier trends. We think there is insufficient attention to both about who controls these new technologies and how they will impact shared prosperity when they are thus unequally controlled. There is, in fact, a real chance, we argue, that AI, generative AI, and associated digital technologies could serve only a small elite and therefore undermine technological preconditions for shared prosperity in the US and around the world. And the way to understand this is always to consider where the powerful notions that shape technology originate and what the preconditions for that vision to impact society in different ways are. So we have been here before in some sense, both in terms of the debates about whether technology will bring work or will benefit workers and regular people, and also about very powerful personalities whose ideas shape how technology is developed and applied. So here is one example to illustrate that as a cautionary tale from the book. This is Ferdinand de Lesseps. He's the equivalent of the tech optimists of Silicon Valley of today. He was a very skillful entrepreneur and diplomat who believed in both trade bringing widespread benefits for people and technology solving problems, and combined this vision with his considerable skills to convince against all odds to convince Egyptians and the French elites to go along with the Suez Canal in a particular form that would be very fast transport across the oceans. And he turned out to be right, both in terms of the technological developments, the feasibility of his plans, and the huge demand for shipping, to transoceanic shipping. And he became a celebrity around Europe with tremendous power and prestige. Le Grand Français, he was called in his country. But then He applied the same optimism in the Panama Canal, or in Panama, and the conditions were very different. He was very blind to the suffering or possible suffering of people, and his scheme was a complete failure. The canal couldn't be built. 22,000 people, including several thousand of the French engineers and workers who were shipped there, died, and the whole project had to be abandoned until several decades later, when the Americans took it over and did a course correction relative to Lesseps' plans. So this is sort of cautionary tale when technological development and our political system empower a few people who are very optimistic to make very consequential decisions. But economic theory says perhaps we don't have to worry too much about this. If new technology will naturally and automatically benefit all of us, its direction doesn't matter, and if there is optimism, who cares? Perhaps not all of the optimism will be realized, but at the end we'll all benefit. This is actually a very common idea in economics, and I used to take it for granted as well, so much so that, in fact, in economics, we don't have a name for it. So Simon and I had to christen it, and we called it the productivity bandwagon. The idea that technology improves, this increases productivity, and the productivity benefit generates a number of forces that lead to the benefits of the workers. Now, if you want to read history through the lenses of the productivity bandwagon, you can find plenty of examples where technological advances ultimately, sometimes very quickly, brought benefits for society and for workers. But if you are skeptical, you can also find many examples in which it didn't happen. Here, I'm plotting two of them. The first one is one of the most important technological breakthroughs of the Middle Ages, the windmill. But because it was controlled by the aristocracy and the clergy, and they could do with it whatever they please in a coercive labor market, there were no benefits for workers. Productivity increased. There was some increase in surplus, but that surplus was captured by aristocrats and clergy. Peasants and farm workers did not benefit. Even more jarring is the object on the right, which is a cotton gin. This is the version from Eli Whitney, although he may not have been the first person who thought of this cotton gin. This was used for cleaning the heavy-seeded southern cotton, and it almost overnight transformed the southern economy from a backwater to one of the most dynamic parts of the world economy, the largest supplier of cotton, which itself fueled the British Industrial Revolution. And tremendous fortunes were made thanks to this cotton economy. But the workers who actually produced the cotton were the enslaved Black people. Their conditions got much worse. They were moved to deeper south, where cotton plantations were built. Conditions in cotton plantations were much worse, much harsher working conditions, longer working hours, and no evidence that their real incomes increased. But you might think these are historical examples, and things are different today, or things are different during the more transformative experiences such as the Industrial Revolution. And I think to understand whether they are or not, we need to introduce a couple more concepts. And the key one that I'm going to talk about is automation. By automation, I mean the substitution of machines, and more recently algorithms, for tasks previously performed by labor. The economics profession, in my mind, unfortunately, did not for a long time distinguish automation from other types of technological changes. But once you start thinking about it, you will see that there are forces that could make automation break the productivity bandwagon. Automation means machines displace labor. When that happens, average productivity increases. But marginal productivity of labor, meaning the contribution that workers make to production, does not. The classic example that sometimes is mentioned in public discussions of this is the parable about the future of the modern factory, where it is said it will have two employees, and a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure that the man doesn't touch the equipment. If indeed we are heading towards that sort of future of the factory, average productivity will be very high, huge amount of output divided by the two employees. but marginal productivity is not very high, demand is not so important to the production, nor will the factory need to hire more workers to make sure they take care of the dog either. If that happens, and indeed, very importantly, if automation is not associated with new tasks for workers, so not the feeding dog, but new technical tasks, new production and non-production design tasks where labor can contribute to output, if that doesn't happen, there's no incentives for firms to hire more workers or pay them more, and shared prosperity would collapse. And this is, in fact, exactly what happened in the beginning of the 19th century, in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. From the middle of the 18th century, around 1750, let's say it, with the beginning date of the Industrial Revolution is not fully agreed, but something around 1750 to about 1850, there is a phase of the Industrial Revolution dominated by automation. During this phase, wages did not increase. In fact, real hourly wages may have fallen because workers started working for about 20% more. And working conditions significantly worsened. So all around, it was a bad time for labor. So this is best captured by the power looms or the weaving factories, which is being depicted on the right here. The social conditions were no better. The philosophy of the entrepreneurs during this time was a complete regimented system of labor control. This is captured by another famous economist's idea, the panopticon of Jeremy Bentham, which is shown on the left. It is remembered as a prison system, but actually his brother thought of it as a factory system, and Jeremy Bentham himself emphasized that this should be used in factories. It turned out to be technologically quite not feasible, but even if the panopticon wasn't used, there was a huge amount of monitoring and surveillance and discipline in the factories. And on the right, you see another aspect of the early damage from Industrial Revolution. Cities were hugely polluted, infectious diseases were rampant, and life expectancy at birth in British cities such as Manchester may have fallen to around 30 years at birth, which is incredibly low. Now, all of this you might still dismiss as saying this is history, and look, things have turned around, and Industrial Revolution did bring benefits. And indeed, today we are fortunate, very fortunate, because we are much more comfortable, healthier, prosperous relative to people who lived 200 years ago. And that's partly or largely because of the process that industrial machinery brought. But these concerns are not just history, they are relevant for today. And one way of seeing that, again, looking at it from the US angle, is to look at this figure. And this figure shows the ways in which the history is not completely being replicated today, and some ways in which it is. I'm showing here the evolution of real hourly wages for 10 demographic groups, men and women, separated and also distinguished by education, all the way from workers without a high school degree in orange to workers with a postgraduate degree, such as a master's, law school, medical degree, or PhD in dark blue. From the 1963 onwards, you see everything is normalized to zero, so you can trace the cumulative growth in real wages. And you see that the first 15 or so years is a period of shared prosperity. This is the sense in which it's very different from the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. All 10 demographic groups are growing in tandem. They're on top of each other. And what you are also seeing, however, is that this shared prosperity period comes to an end sometime around 1980 with a complete turnaround, a huge increase in inequality, witnessed by the fact that the top and the bottom are diverging. But even more jarring is the fact that the real wages of low education workers, especially low education men, is declining very significantly in the United States. You look at, for example, the orange or the brown curve, or the orange or the green curve, high school and high school dropout real wages, they're falling very sharply in the 1980s and continuing to stagnate in the 2000s. And this is the basis of my claim that modern times aren't that different. The same sort of concerns are there. This is not a US phenomenon. Inequality has increased all around the OECD. No other country has had the kind of steep declines in the earnings at the bottom of the income distribution because of minimum wages, unions, and social norms. But inequality has increased, and many of these countries have had stagnant wage and employment at the bottom of the distribution. Now, to understand why things were different in the 1960s, in fact, into 1950s as well, which has a very similar trend using different data sources, we need to understand when it is that the productivity bandwagon works and when is it that it breaks down. And the thesis of the book is that there are two critical preconditions for the productivity bandwagon: new tasks and worker power. On the right, I'm first showing a picture of the Ford Motor Factory, which was a leader in the introduction of new machinery, electrification, the interchangeable part system, and then the assembly line in the auto industry, and huge productivity increases thanks to Ford's reorganization of the factory. But this wasn't just automation, as you can see from the fact that there are a lot of workers. They are performing technical tasks together with the advanced machinery. And in fact, many of the tasks that workers are performing in the factory floor of this Ford company who did not exist before. And what you're not seeing is also a slew of other tasks, design, inspection, non-production tasks in the background that also Ford was a leader in introducing. But just introducing new tasks, which is critical for the marginal productivity of labor to rise alongside automation, is not enough. And we are back to the same point that I made with the windmills and the Eli Whitney's cotton gin. If political power is very unequal, then even increases in marginal productivity may not translate into higher wages. But what ensured things starting to change in Britain in the second half of the 19th century and in the US in the first half of the 20th century was better organization of workers. So here is again a picture from the auto industry, this time United Auto Workers strike in 1937 against GM, not Ford, but similar things happened against Ford. This is a particularly famous example called the sit-down strike. And labor organization, as they became involved in negotiation of working conditions and wages, they ensured that productivity gains would be somewhat shared with workers. And now, with this conceptual framework, why is it that things started going wrong in the digital age? And I think the short answer is the same two preconditions that I just outlined started coming apart. First, we had a lot of automation in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, but very little new tasks. So here you see a modern factory for producing cars, but what's absent are all of those workers involved in technical and inspection tasks. It's much more automated. There are many fewer tasks, new tasks for workers. Now, if you are not a believer in the importance of automation, you may doubt that that is so important in the patterns that I have shown you. So here is a graph from a paper of mine with Pasquale Restrepo, which is hopefully useful in convincing you that automation is actually quite central. And what you can see here is I have on the vertical axis the cumulative change from 1980 to 2016, so that period where inequality was increasing and real wages were declining. Now I've collapsed that into a single number. I'm looking at more detailed demographic groups distinguished by gender and education, as well as age and ethnicity. So there are more circles here. You can see many of those are below the zero lines. Those are the ones that have lost real wages since 1980. But critically on the horizontal axis, I have the extent of automation that each one of these groups has been subjected to, measured as what fraction of the tasks that this group, this demographic group, used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated. And you can see that for postgraduate workers or workers, most workers with college degrees, these are very close to zero. Not much automation that has impacted managers and engineers and lawyers. But for manual workers and for office workers and low education demographic groups, that's as high as 20-25%. And the regression line shows that there is a very striking relationship between automation and inequality. And in fact, about 60 to 70% of the increase in between group inequality in the United States can be explained by automation and its unequal effects on different demographic groups. But this is not the only thing. The other one is that political power shifted away from labor. That was both because of new visions, new ideas, especially companies becoming much more justified in their quest to look after shareholder values. The famous economist Milton Friedman was an important player in this, in his emphasis that the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, which means you can cut wages, you can sideline labor, and also any organizations that could stand in the way of automation and other methods in order to sideline labor were themselves becoming weaker. For example, the process of deindustrialization, but even perhaps more importantly, the complete defeat of the professional air traffic controller strike in 1981, when Ronald Reagan fired them all and started a trend of much harsher attitudes from businesses against striking workers. Now, the age of AI can be different. AI technologies are a continuation of previous digital trends, but they have many new capabilities. And in fact, generative AI, I have argued in work that I have done since the book, has great capability to complement human workers by providing better, more reliable, and more diverse information. But again, visions, just like Lesseps' vision was important in taking us to ruin or success, visions are important. And Simon and I argue that the current tech industry is engulfed by a vision we call orthodoxy of machine intelligence, autonomous machine intelligence, and hence automation, for example, as encapsulated by the Turing test, whereas an alternative vision, which was actually quite important early on, is feasible and would be socially much more beneficial. We call that machine usefulness. Your objective shouldn't be to create more and more intelligent machines in and of themselves, and certainly autonomous machine intelligence is not an aim to be pursued in the abstract. What we should try to do is try to make machines as useful as possible. This is what animated some very remarkable people, such as, for example, Douglas Engelbart, who single-handedly invented many of the technologies that we depend on today, computer maps, hypertext, many of the screen-driven technologies in the 1950s, actually. This is not just about inequality. We also explain why fixation on machine intelligence leads to very low productivity growth. Part of that is what Pasquale Restrepo and I call social automation, meaning that you automate tasks in which humans are quite good. As a result, you don't get much of a productivity benefit, but you get a lot of distributional effects. And let me skip this. I was supposed to be how ChatGPT thinks about automation. But an equally important emphasis in the book is what this all implies for our social lives and for social democracy, and the path of autonomous machine intelligence and the industry trends in the tech sector are actually quite worrying. They are intensifying surveillance, and they are creating a monopoly of control of information and how it can be used without checks and balances. You see that with the large tech companies in the United States, such as Facebook, Google, Amazon, and you see that in the way in which the Chinese Communist Party uses it. To some of you, it might appear preposterous that we are comparing the Chinese Communist Party and these large corporations. Yes, of course, I would prefer to be subject to Google or Facebook's whims than the Chinese Communist parties. But in the book, we argue there are a lot of parallels in how they are using information and their vision of how information should be used. Let me skip that, but what starts in the US is not confined to the US. It spreads around the world. It changes the international division of labor, affecting all of Europe, but also the emerging world. And then in the book, we end with a discussion of what we can do. And the most important idea is that we have to change the narrative. The narrative currently is driven by a techno-optimism and the view that the future of technology is bright, and we make it even more bright. We have to empower very talented entrepreneurs and engineers, and we have to change that narrative. Techno-optimism, I think, is not warranted. How we use the technology is more important than whether we have the immediate rollout of ChatGPT to 3 billion people. And I think society should not be sidelined in those decisions. So changing the narrative away from Sam Altman and Elon Musk deciding the future of technology to global citizenry having a voice in this. This, of course, requires institutions and countervailing powers. This is the sort of thing that developed in the United States. For example, consumer protection, civil society action that Ralph Nader used to signify in the 1970s, and the labor organization, which has since collapsed, and people are experimenting with new models. I don't think any of the models are viable yet, but we need to find some new institutional structure for better regulation, better civil society pressure, as well as better voice for workers. And finally, in all of this, the perspective of the book is this is not about just dividing the cake. This is about the direction of technology, which determines the shape of the cake and the size of the cake. And many people, including like Doug Engelbart that I mentioned, and several other key engineers and scientists, were in line with this machine usefulness vision. Another one of them is Ted Nelson, who very clearly saw in the 1970s that personal computers could be liberating tool in the hands of workers and citizens, or tools for repression, and outlined ways in which one versus the other outcome could be realized. Of course, it may appear that if all we want is new institutions to emerge to redirect technological change, that is fraught with danger, and perhaps even is Pollyanna-ish that it couldn't happen. So let me end by showing one example of very swift and very powerful change in the direction of technology from very little impetus. And at the end of the day, some mistakes have been made, but the outcome of a modicum of policy action, regulatory action, and civil society involvement has been quite remarkable, and it's the energy sector. We've known about climate change since at least 1980, but as late as 2010, you couldn't do much about it because there was no alternative to fossil fuels. Since 2010 in Europe, to some degree in China and in the US, there has been much greater emphasis for developing renewable energy. And what has happened is that from being about 10 times as expensive as fossil fuels, wind and solar and different types of wind have become cost competitive with fossil fuels. And that is mostly about technological change. So the book argues whatever took place in the energy sector can take place more generally in the context of production processes and control of information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Daron, for this lesson. It was, in fact, a high-level lesson. I think we have here opportunity to have a good discussion. Okay, I will start with Oscar Afonso, that is the director of our Faculty of Economy here in Oporto. He has written lots of papers, and he told me that you are the one that he sits most a lot. So, Oscar, do you want to make any question? I ask for some brief so that we can have the most people to ask them. Oscar Afonso, please.
No, I don't have any specific question, but okay, but we can ask if the new revolution in technology is worse for some type of workers more than for others, like for medium-skilled workers and low-skilled workers instead of high-skilled workers. I don't know if.
Okay, we can settle 3 questions. Okay, Daron, you don't mind? Okay,
sure, perfect.
Albert Castro, do you want to make your little question, please? We know that you have to leave, but okay, but we'll try to make the 3 questions. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation, your summary of the book. I'm actually listening to it in English, and I'm halfway through. But I would like to go to the last chapter, to the more, not just the diagnosis, but what can we do? And it's interesting because when I did my PhD, the main book, my reference was Albert Hirschman's Exit, Voice and Loyalty. And in a sense, we are back to some of the problems that he raised. And I would like for you to elaborate a bit more on, let's say, how can we build this, I think it's the words that you use, countervailing power. Is this possible? Is this, for instance, this strike of the auto workers is any example that things can change? What do you do with that? Thank you.
Okay. Now we change. We have other people to ask, maybe Castavaz and other, but later. João Ramos was a former journalist in Expresso, that is the biggest newspaper we have here in Portugal, and he was expert in economy, technology, things like that. Do you want to make any questions, João, please?
Okay, thank you.
Very briefly, okay. Very briefly.
First, you are listening to me? Okay.
Yes, please.
Well, I have a question for Daron. How can the government and the legislators could manage the generative artificial intelligence, and how can these legislators could manage the advance in the near future?
Okay, Daron, can you answer to these 3 questions, please? The
Sure,
first
of
one.
course. Lots to say on each one of them, but let me be brief so that we can have more room. First of all, on Oscar's question, I think the subtext of the question is, technological changes, especially when they are radical, along the lines of the Schumpeterian creative destruction, will always destroy the rents or benefits of some group. I think that is understood, and I don't think you want to be in the business as a civil society or government regulation to protect every little group. I think the issue that we're trying to emphasize is that this could be almost the entire workforce. And this is where the productivity bandwagon idea comes in, because in the basic economic models, what you get is that there could be distributional effects, but average wages always increase. And what my work has emphasized, and the book sort of summarizes, is that actually there are good reasons for average wages to decline with technological changes if those focus on automation, monitoring, and also they're associated with worsening of the balance of power between capital and labor. The other 2 questions, I think, are related in that they are raising questions about the feasibility of the alternative path, or feasibility of reaching the alternative path from starting from today. And I think they're both on target. Building countervailing powers is hard, and what we are asking of the government is not easy. Even in the area of climate change, there were many government programs that were meant to subsidize clean energy that ended up wasteful. And the situation may be much harder in the case of, say, creating more labor complementary technologies. We outline some of the ways in which that can be done in terms of regulation. I think you have to go gradual, and also what we emphasize is, rather than fancy new ideas such as robot taxes, what you want to do is remove existing distortions that favor capital against labor, in particular the asymmetric treatment of capital and labor, which creates, in our argument and according to some of the research that I've done, an artificial boost to automation and generates inequality. So I think that's how you would have to start, but then also use tools such as antitrust and safety regulations in the case of generative AI, which are quite the things that we are talking about. In terms of the
Yes, sorry.
question of countervailing powers.
You must take out the sound.
Era. É isso. Então pronto. Então fiz aquilo no
Excuse me,
automático.
you have to put down the
Tá
sound, okay? Okay, sorry.
Thank you. No problem. No problem. In terms of the countervailing powers, you're absolutely right. That is a hard thing, Alberto. But again, I think we are in a liminal moment when things are changing. And countervailing powers has 2 elements. One is government regulation embedded in society, embedded in civil society movements and voice. And you're seeing how quickly that changed in the United States. Things that people thought would be not possible, like a lawsuit against Google and Amazon, the first time against tech industries, really. And there is a new regulatory movement. Are they doing exactly the right things? No, there are some problems with the approach, but the change in the mood and the availability of tools that exist in the hands of the regulators when the mood changes is striking. In terms of the labor organizations, I think that's an even harder problem. No, I don't think the current UAW is the right model. I also don't think the current labor organizations are the right model. But on the other hand, the Writers Guild strike shows a more forward-looking face of labor. Of course, that's a special group that has a lot of power because they could bring Hollywood and TV to stand still. But the Writers Guild strike was all about AI and who controls productivity, who controls technology. And it actually led to big concessions by the Hollywood studios. So I think we have a lot to learn from the Writers Guild strike and how it was resolved. But building new labor organizations is not easy. I'm not fooling myself that that's going to happen overnight, or that we know exactly what those labor organizations are going to look like.
Okay, done. Customers, do you want to make any brief question, please? And then we pass to other people.
Just very briefly, and first of all, thank you for the excellent presentation and a very wise vision about this issue of the artificial intelligence, which is much more complicated than it seems at first sight. And I think the way it was presented, I think it's quite useful for makers thinking about the future.
Thank you.
There was an issue that was very briefly touched, I believe, which is the issue of regulation and supervision of these new forms of artificial intelligence, if any. As I was a former regulator of the financial sector, I always have seen supervision and regulation lagging behind innovation. Do you think it will be the case here, or don't you see any role for regulation or supervision?
Okay. Orlando, do you want to make any comment or question, please? Orlando Montesilo is also expert on these topics. Although you are a lawyer, I think you also lead with this, please.
Thank you very much. Well, not exactly an expert. In fact, my question was very much related to Professor Tavares' one, which will be about the cleverest way to put social value in a regulation of issues like ChatGPT and artificial intelligence. So shouldn't we change the traditional patterns of regulation regarding to those that we are applying right now?
Okay.
Very good. Actually, those two questions are very similar.
Yes, please.
I take those two because I think they are very related and they're two excellent questions.
Please.
No, absolutely. As Orlando says, I think we have to change the values. Part of the problem in the tech industry has been this belief that tech entrepreneurs are not responsible. They not have to take the social values into account. But you cannot just do that by teaching them ethics in their computer classes, or the newspapers just talking about ethics. That's where regulation and institutional change has to be complementary to a change in norms and values, as well as the industry organization has to change. For example, I think one of the aspects of the industry that has really made responsibility very scant is venture capital fueled growth model, where you grow at all costs very rapidly, and then all the damage you do on the process, like for example, Facebook's growth to having over 2 billion people in just a handful of years, was, I think, a textbook case of that. So I think this is where regulation has to come in. And you're absolutely right, Carlos. Regulation has to be a couple of steps behind. There's no way you can do forward-looking regulation. It's very difficult. In fact, I think AI increases the difficulty of regulation. For instance, the GDPR in Europe gives an example of that, which was very well-meaning and I think not foolish, but it has not worked very well because the industry found ways of circumventing the regulation. So you need to find a much more dynamic way of regulating. While regulation has to lag, that doesn't mean that it's ineffective. If regulatory muscle can be developed and if the expertise can be built within the government on regulation, I think regulation can be very powerful, because the threat of regulation, lawsuits, and blockage of some of the rollout of these technologies could be very powerful. But it should be complemented with one thing else. While the US government has always been behind the industry, in every industry, in regulation, in certain cases, it was actually ahead, for example, in setting the agenda. So if you look at US government, especially the defense industry, the Defense Department and some associated branches of the government, they were ahead of defining certain problems in aerospace, in actually antibiotics and their rollout, in computers and the internet. So I think there is room for the government to play that sort of role of setting the agenda and putting some resources behind it, while, of course, I don't think there is any justification for the government to try to do those innovations itself. The private sector is much more dynamic and much better placed to undertake the innovation, but there could be government leadership in terms of setting the agenda as well as regulation coming ex post.
Okay, perfect. Now we have here with us João Taborda. He works for Embraer, that is a high-known technological company. João Pedro, do you want to make any question to Daron from your experience with technology?
Yes, thank you, Jaime. Professor Daron, it's an absolute honor. We cannot thank enough Jaime for making these minutes available. I read Why the Nations Fail, and he's a Bible is upstairs, ready to be consulted, recommended. No, well, it's not. It's really a manual. It's a book to read and to consult. And in my thesis back 20 years ago, I studied also the theory of institutions by Douglas North. So I saw a lot of parallel in that analysis. I think what we see in the aerospace industry, and you briefly mentioned defense, we are definitely looking at the task level, which tasks are replaceable, and we have to move down from the discussion of the job description, but looking at the task and taking an approach of what is the technology that can help the person there to work better, more informed, and take better decisions. So we approach, in many cases, we established 2 plants in Portugal, with the highest levels of robots in the whole group, and we tested that. And maybe I'd like to hear your comment about that, because we really had to move the discussion to the task level and less and have a discussion less focused on the job description.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, another question then. Okay, I'm controlling the time, don't worry. We have here Marcel Nuno, that is in Angola, I think, and you would like also to make a little question to Daron. Marcel, are you listening? And please be very brief, okay? You're not listening, Marcel?
Yeah, I'm listening. Not in Angola, I'm in Oman.
Briefly, yes, please.
Yeah, so you mentioned quite often in your discussions on your writings that we should slow down or regulating the pace of innovation, especially what is related to AI rollout. So what I want to ask you is that, do you think this is feasible on a larger scale in the global world that you have today? Meaning with highly intercommunicated and rapid evolving landscape you have today, with information and technology immediately available, unfiltered, and at an unprecedented scales. Do you think this is possible? How do you think that you can redirect that technology innovation on a global scale? Do you think this is not over-optimistic and even risky?
Okay. Do you want to answer, and then we'll try to have some more questions?
Perfect. First, Charles' question, 100%. I mean, 100%. This has been the emphasis of my work for almost 20 years. Over the last 15 plus years, I've been working on task-based models and task-based empirical work in order to get to this. And also, when you start thinking about it task-based, it also becomes very clear. Automation is with us. It's going to be with us. There's no way you can imagine automation not being a part of the industrial process, industrial innovation. And also, you don't want to get rid of automation. It's a very important thing. People, for example, in manufacturing in the United States, they are doing many fewer of the very physically straining, very dangerous tasks. The issue is, can we also at the same time make humans more productive in the tasks that they're producing, and also make the production more advanced by introducing new tasks that use human skills? That was the point of my Ford factory example. And I think the promise of AI, generative AI, is exactly that. If you can use these technologies to provide better information, better training, better problem solving, much more real-time activity by very diverse people, electricians, nurses, blue-collar workers, educators, I think there is the possibility of new tasks and a very different type of thing. But I think that's the issue, which is, can we put as much emphasis on creating new tasks and making workers more productive using these tools as we put on automation? That's the point. And I think the right type of planning at the task level is a very important ingredient of it. And I think the problem that Simon and I emphasize is that if you become obsessed with autonomous machine intelligence, you start sidelining workers. Machines are almost so much better. Why should we make humans more productive? And that's the problem that I think the tech industry has been gripped by over the last 20 years, or if not longer. In terms of slowing down innovation, I am pro-innovation. My purpose is not to slow down innovation. I think we have potential for huge innovative steps. But if it's a choice between fast innovation in the wrong direction and slower, more deliberative innovation, more aligned with social objectives, I'll take the second every day of the week. Is it possible to slow down innovation? Absolutely. Let me give you one example. ChatGPT, from its rollout a year ago, it became the fastest spreading technology in human history. Did it have to be that way? For example, shouldn't people have worried that if you roll out ChatGPT like this, it might actually destroy schools? They can no longer use the existing curriculum. You cannot check homeworks. You cannot get students to distinguish between reliable and unreliable information. So there was no reason for rolling out ChatGPT without first beta testing it. In an alternative universe, you would first adopt something like the large language model of OpenAI in some number of test schools, see how students use it, how teachers use it, what are the negative and the positive effects, and then you decide how to roll it out. Would the industry have done that? Sure, if they were worried of a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit because their uncontrolled rollout has damaged the industry, they would have not rolled it out this way. Or if you have a different regulatory regime where you have to get permission for technologies that play the role of humans. For example, I think it's completely reasonable to say that a large language model that has no certification, no training, shouldn't give very advanced and complex healthcare information like physicians do. But right now, there's no regulatory framework for that. So in an alternative institutional setup, there will be a regulatory framework. And if you want to roll out a large language model with applications in healthcare, you actually need to do some testing. If you had a regulatory framework like that, that would have slowed down the rollout of ChatGPT. And I think it wouldn't have been a disaster. In fact, probably it would have been a good thing, both for the industry, because they would have put emphasis on developing higher quality products, better data, more reliable information. It's remarkable that even though the hallucination problems of large language models have been known for about 5-6 years, the industry has still not done anything. In an alternative institutional framework, they would have done it. And here is the thought experiment about your last point. Would this be inadvisable even if we can do it? Imagine we are sitting in this conversation in 100 years from now. There is very little likelihood that we would say, oh my God, the people in 2023, they were such idiots. They delayed the rollout of ChatGPT by 1 year. But they could say they were so irresponsible, they put us on a path that destroyed work, that destroyed information, that created two-tier society, that created uncontrollable technological races. So I think the downside is much greater from not regulating these technologies.
Okay, so I think we are going to a final set of questions. I have also one question before I pass it to Nuno. Nuno Santos, do you want also to make a question? I know you are very keen on Daron and his books. Do you want to make a question? Okay, so Paulo, that is also co-organizing with me this event. Paulo, please make a question, then I will also close the session. Okay, thank you.
Jaime, you are asking me?
Yes, please make a comment to or the question to Daron, please.
The comment that is a great, it was a great discussion, of course, a very important topic, and thanks to organize this meeting. It is a great pleasure to me and to Media21 to support and to advise in terms of the logistic of this smart discussion. So thank you very much and congratulations, because
Thank you
I think we had a great discussion. So, and of course, great discussion, great approach, a very, very important topic. So I think I don't have any particular questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Dan, do you want to make a final comment before closing, please?
Oh, I think you had a question, Jaime.
Yes, I have a question. Okay, I can make a question to you and then
I'll close.
Okay, so the question I have to put to you is the following. When you wrote Why Nations Fail, you had the idea to try to explain in a very concrete way why, in fact, most nations were not capable, we can say, to have a consistent developing agenda for the future. From what you see now, in terms of the new world agenda, the new multilateralism, the technological waves, do you think that the message of Why Nation Fails is still updating? How do you make the connection between this fantastic book that you have now, that we are reading, Power and Progress, and Why Nations That Fail, that is, as someone told before, a Bible for all of us?
Thank you very much, Jaime. Let me make 2 points. One of them is that I think the broader message of Why Nations Fail is the importance of inclusive institutions, which also have to adapt to times. And I think the type of institutions we need to develop in the age of AI are somewhat different than the institutions that could serve us okay in the age of interchangeable part system or the assembly line at the beginning of the 20th century. And that makes perfect sense from that perspective. But there's one big difference in Why Nations Fail. Because we were looking at the historical sweep, we said it's very, very important to avoid blocking any type of technological change, because that's one of the channels via which many countries were left behind. I completely believe that blocking technological change is not the right approach, but I think you have tools to change the direction of technological change without blocking it. And the way that the image that I have in my mind is blocking the technological changes to put a dam in front of a river. You don't let it flow. What I think we need to think about is how can we make the river flow towards the right place rather than the wrong place? And that's a harder problem, but it's a feasible problem. In terms of where we are, since the Why Nations Fail was completed in 2010, since then, actually, the world has become much less friendly to inclusive institutions.
Yes.
Democracy is weaker. Many countries have consolidated their non-democratic regimes, or democracies have become authoritarian in places like, Poland, Hungary, Brazil, Turkey, and technology is actually playing a role in this, because people used to celebrate social media and the internet as tools of liberation in the beginning of the 2000s. Now we realize those tools are much more easily controlled by governments such as the Chinese, Russian, or the Iranian government, and sometimes the US government and US corporations. And we have to also find a way of leveraging these technologies to support democracy rather than to undermine democracy.
Okay.
Jaime, can I make a last question?
Okay, we have still 2 minutes now. You don't mind? Okay. This is the last question. We have to finish because we are approaching the end. Very, very, very brief. Okay, Rui, please.
Thank you, Jaime. Hi, Daron. Thank you for your presentation. Back to the bandwidth productivity question. I want your opinion on the way societies will move towards the week of lesser work days, like the 3 days or even the 2 days working week, and related to the universal wage, the minimum universal salary. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, those are very difficult questions, so I cannot do justice to them in 2 minutes. But in the book, we're not in favor of universal basic income because we view it as a defeatist strategy. It says we cannot create jobs, we cannot create good jobs, meaningful jobs for people, so let's just give them UBI. But we think that there is a possibility to make human labor still important, and we think human labor is still central in terms of creativity, problem solving, adaptability. So that's why I don't think we have to go to UBI. But there's another problem with UBI and with other schemes that are just based on redistribution rather than creating good jobs for people with diverse skills. They would create a two-tier society. If you go to a UBI in which 5% of the population in Silicon Valley create all the value, and then their incomes are redistributed to the remaining 95%, that would be a very, very hierarchical society. And we won't even get there because you see those 5% will be so powerful that they will undermine redistribution. They will try to consolidate their power. So I don't think that's if there was no other option, of course I would support UBI, but I don't think it's a feasible or attractive plan.
Perfect, Daron. One last question. Have you already been in Portugal or not recently?
Of course, yes. Not recently. The last time I was there was 10 years ago or so.
So you must come again. We will try that, okay?
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. It was great talking to you. Thanks for your listening and for your wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye, Daron. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Boa tarde. Bye-bye. Thank you.